Mix Run is located off PA Route 555, which is part of Pennsylvania's scenic elk route, where one can theoretically see elk. In all my time spent on 555, I've yet to see an elk, but I do know that they are there, as I one afternoon had to sit and wait in my car for some time while driving down Route 46 north of Emporium. It took the elk about 15 minutes or so, what felt like an eternity, before it decided that being in the middle of the road was probably not the best place for it. I wouldn't say it wasn't the best place for it because it's a busy road, because it is not, but mainly because it didn't have anything on the road to eat. Anyway, Mix Run, it's off PA 555, across the Bennett branch of the Cinemahoning. It is out there, and I mean that. Mix Run is not even tracked by the U.S. Census Bureau, though the Census Bureau cannot be missing many people out there. The closest town with a post office is Driftwood, which itself is well off the beaten path. Mix Run would not have been seen on a map anymore at all were it not the birthplace of an early Hollywood legend. In fact, the archetype of the Western cowboy was born not in the American Southwest, but in rural Cameron County. This is the story of Tom Mix, the celluloid cowboy. Tom Mix was born at Mix Run on January 6, 1880. Mix Run at that time was still a thriving lumber town, which was named after Tom's distant grandfather of some greatness. The Mix family was fairly well off, with his father being something of a mid-level lumber merchant. On my birthday in June 1888, I was born a little less than 100 years after, but same day, whatever. Anyway, in June 1888, the city of Du Bois suffered a devastating fire that wiped out nearly all of the downtown area. Du Bois, formerly named after its founder John Rumbarger, was by that time and remains to this day named after the lumber magnate John Du Bois, who made the town what it is, a hub of the booming lumber industry. Lumber was cheap, lumber was everywhere, homes, fences, even some of the downtown streets were paved boardwalks. And that fire was devastating, but the city rebuilt and the Mix family moved to the Clearfield County town in the wake of the fire, with Tom's father possibly opening a livery stable. And I say possibly because I've seen other histories where it says Tom's father, Edwin, took a position as a stable master and chauffeur for the lumber baron John E. Du Bois. Either way, Tom's first experiences working with horses came from the time that he spent with the animals by way of his father. As a teenager, Tom would go on to work for Du Bois, the man for whom, again, the town is named and mispronounced. On a trip to the county seat of Clearfield County, Clearfield, Tom was said to be inspired into a life of show business, having seen Buffalo Bill's Wild West touring show. Shortly afterwards, in April of 1898, Mix would enlist in the United States Army, rising to artillery sergeant. At this point in time, the details of Mix's life become pretty hazy. Despite there being a paper trail and, within a decade, a very public career, there's a lot of obfuscation. Recently, I watched a film reel made in the days following Mix's death. The mournful reel pads Mix's accomplishments, and maybe I'll just quote the reel here. The life of Tom Mix was punctuated by adventures as thrilling as those of any fictitious character he ever portrayed. During the Cuban campaign of the Spanish-American War, he served as a scout of Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. Severely wounded there, he would later transfer to the Philippines, where he participated in the Luzon campaign. He was present at the siege of Peking during the Boxer Rebellion, and as a competent horse wrangler, he witnessed the final battles of the Boer War in South Africa. Returning to the United States, he successfully became a cowboy in Texas and Oklahoma, and a professional peace officer. He served as a sheriff at Montgomery County, Kansas, Washington County, Oklahoma, and Two Buttes County, Colorado. He was a United States Marshal in Montana, New Mexico, and Arizona, and as a Texas Ranger, was twice wounded in gunfights with bandits and rustlers. Nearly all the claims in that excerpt were fictitious. There's not even a Two Buttes County in Colorado, and there never was, though there is a town of Two Buttes which lies in Baca County, Colorado, and that region has never really recovered from the Dust Bowl. In fact, Baca County was kind of the epicenter of the Dust Bowl of the 1920s and 30s. That's aside the point. I've read in some places that Tom Mix was approached by screenwriters regarding some sort of biography back in 1925 or abouts, and as they were looking for a story, he felt obligated to supply them with one that was cobbled together from bits of characters he had portrayed, tied together with strong chords of bunkum from his own imagination. Things became so convoluted that Tom Mix has been called the myth on horseback. What is true, though, is that in April of 1898, Tom enlisted in the United States Army. He never served overseas, not even in nearby Cuba. He was assigned to Fort Hancock, New Jersey, where he met a schoolteacher, Grace Allen, whom he married and subsequently failed to report back to duty. The marriage was annulled the following year, 1903, and by that time Mix was no longer in the Army, having been discharged. At this point, he meandered through the American West before ending up in Oklahoma, which was still a territory at the time, not yet a state. While there, Mix worked as a bartender and was for a brief time in 1911 a marshal in Dewey, Oklahoma. More notably, he was a drum major for the Oklahoma Cavalry Band and is said to have joined them when they appeared at the Chicago World's Fair. Most fortunately, Mix parlayed his capabilities with horses into a job with several Wild West show touring outfits like the Buffalo Bill Show, which had first inspired him when he was still living in Pennsylvania. In 1909 or 1910, Mix was working at the notable Miller's Brothers 101 Ranch when he was hired by pioneer filmmaker William Colonel Seelig for the purpose of handling and training horses, as well as keeping the animals from injuring the film cast and crew, and vice versa. There appears to be some confusion over which was Tom Mix's first film, as it's often cited as being Ranch Life in the Great Southwest or The Cowboy Millionaire. Regardless, both films were produced by Seelig and directed by Francis Boggs. In the 10-minute documentary reel that is Ranch Life in the Great Southwest, Mix plays himself, another cowboy at the 101 Ranch. Some contemporary reports state that Mix wasn't much of a cowboy in those days and that his jobs on the ranch revolved around hosting dudes, the weekend tourists, who were vacationing in the West from the East Coast. The claims that Tom wasn't much of a cowboy are perhaps based more on envy. Granted, I'm not exactly familiar with the metrics of cowboying, but for all the lore and lies that surround Mix's life, it can't be overstated that he was, in fact, extremely good with horses and trick riding and roping and shooting, and his movies relied heavily upon these, which he did on his own without any special effects or often enough additional shots or certainly no stuntmen. As many of these films he appeared in were under tight budget constraints. Tom Mix, it has been said, was in fact Hollywood's first stuntman, and I guess the argument could be made for that. Mix's first movies for William Seelig's Polyscope Company were Western Cowboy Affairs. Seelig and Boggs were both impressed enough with how Mix came across on the screen that they sent him to Florida, where they were preparing to shoot a couple of jungle-based movies with Tom in a supporting role in 1911's Back to the Primitive. After returning to the West, Seelig offered Tom a series starring a fictionalized version of himself being Mix and not Seelig. The first in the single-reel series was 1914's The Real Thing in Cowboys. By the time Mix was in the movies, he was married for a third time, his first two marriages being over within a year's time. The first being to the schoolteacher Grace Allen, and the second marriage in the year following his leaving the Army, 1904, was to Kitty Jewel Perrine. His third wife was a cowgirl from Dewey, Oklahoma named Olive Stokes. and they had appeared together in the Millers Brothers touring Wild West shows. Olive and Tom would have a daughter, Ruth, born in 1912. Mix would marry 5 times through the course of his life, but it was to his 4th that he was married the longest. Tom Mix's marriage to his 3rd wife, Olive Stokes, ended in 1917, so that he could pursue Victoria Ford, with whom he had often co-starred in the roughly 100 films that he would make under Selig. Victoria and Tom would have a daughter together, Thomasina, born in 1922. Victoria quit the film business around the time of Thomasina's birth. She and Tom Mix would divorce in 1931, and Mix would go on to marry his 5th wife the following year, while performing with the Sells Florida Circus, where Maybelle Hubbell Ward was an acrobat. He would remain with Mabel until his death. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. In 1917, Tom Mix had made over 100 films with Selig and was in the process of divorcing cowgirl Olive Stokes, wife number 3, for the actress Victoria Ford. Selig's company was at the time in a rough patch, and both Mix and Ford would go on to sign with the Fox Film Corporation. During that time with the Fox Film Corporation, that Mix would go on to define the Western cowboy and the Western film archetype, not only with the characters he portrayed, but also with the writing that he contributed. His horse Tony became nearly as recognizable to film audiences as the man sitting above him. In fact, Tony the horse would be the first animal to receive equal billing as a human, and in fact would appear as the central star in 3 of his own films: Just Tony in 1922, Oh You Tony in 1924, and Tony Runs Wild in 1926. When Tom Mix pressed his hands into the sidewalk outside Grauman's Chinese Theater in 1927, Tony would do so alongside behind him, his hooves, not hands, albeit. It is interesting to note that the famed Grauman's Chinese Theater was not yet a year old when Mix and Tony were immortalized in the cement out front. During his height in the film world with Fox, which ended late 1928, Mix was earning as much as $7,500 a week. This is the equivalent to $100,200 in today's currency, give or take at 20. But as quickly as it came in, the money was spent. Beyond having 5 wives and 2 children, Tom had a thing for sports cars, fancy cowboy suits, and because of the horses in his life, space and upkeep for said horses. While still with Fox, Tom purchased several acres in what is now Los Angeles Echo Park neighborhood and built Mixville, a large Western set. Of Mixville, his ex-wife Olive Stokes would write in her book, The Fabulous Tom Mix, when Tom reigned as William Fox's biggest star in the post-war, being post-World War I, side note, period, he had an even more elaborate organization for the production of his pictures than with Selig. Production activities were carried on at a special studio lot covering 12 acres of ground near Edendale, California. This home of Tom's Fox Pictures was appropriately called Mixville. Tom was the undisputed king of Mixville, just as he was the king of the screen cowboys. Many of the interior scenes were made at Mixville. Almost everything pertaining to the Old West could be found tucked away somewhere in this unique little settlement. Indeed, the vast lot was a miniature West in itself. There was a complete frontier town with a dusty street, hitching rails, a saloon, jail, bank, doctor's office, surveyor's office, and the simple frame houses typical of the early Western era. Only the signs on the buildings were changed from picture to picture, and some rearrangement of the furnishings. There was an Indian village with several lodges nested in a flat place on land at the rear of the lot. From the range of plaster of Paris mountains surrounding the village, Tom led many a convincing attack on a tribe of warriors, and the whole thing looked ferociously real when the picture reached the screen. There was a plot of simulated desert too, through which Tom and Tony wandered on many an occasion on their search for the bad man. For although Tom preferred actual locations, the Fox executives always held the budget over his head. Among other things at Mixville, there were a ranch house, sands, and a ceiling, of course, a corral that would hold 100 horses, and a great barn-like structure to hold props such as saddles, uniforms, guns, and various items of furniture that conformed to the Old West tradition. By the end of the 1920s, Tom Mix had left Fox, signing on with FBO, a forerunner to RKO, but he would eventually leave there, temporarily retiring from the motion picture industry in favor of touring with a circus. When asked about what issues were at FBO, Mix stated that Joseph Kennedy, the financier backing FBO, was a, quote, tight, money-crazed son of a end quote. The decade would close out with Tom as a pallbearer in the funeral of his friend and famous Western lawman White Earp. Earp had spent some time working in Hollywood in the 1920s as a film consultant, and it was in this capacity that Tom had met and befriended him. It is said that Tom had openly wept at Earp's funeral. Though the money was going out almost at the same rate at which it was coming in, Tom was still making a good bit of money. Performing in the circus. His fifth wife, Mabel, was an acrobat in the same circus. I think I've mentioned this before already, but who cares? It's worth repeating. However, as the 1930s and its most famous depression lingered on, the finances weren't as hot. Tom had been charged with tax evasion and paid a significant fine. Tom was upset that his good image had been ruined by a negligent accountant. Regardless, his former wife then took his daughter on an extended trip to Europe on Tom's dime, plus the cost of maintaining a home in Mixville and life while on the road. He even lost a ranch in the process. It was then that Universal Pictures would approach Tom, now in his 50s, about returning to film. A bottle of dark hair dye later, and Tom returned to the film industry with 1932's Destry Rides Again, Rider of Death Valley, and My Pal, the King. These were not silent films, and Tom and the movies did alright, but the popularity was not what it had been in the 20s. Tom had injured himself in one of the stunts as well, as he always did his own stunts. His final film would be 1935's The Miracle Rider, and would feature a stunt double for the first time. Following The Miracle Rider, Tom would leave the films for good. Although they were somewhat successful films, their popularity levels were nothing near to those of Mix's silent films, and I'm repeating this for a purpose. His final performance, The Miracle Rider, 1935, was actually a 15-part serial, so I'm only going to count that as one, and he wrapped it up at age 55, and in that period had produced 9 talkies, sound films. Following his retirement in 1935 from the film industry, Tom purchased a circus and formed a touring circus carrying his name, the Tom Mix Circus. On the night of October 12, 1940, Tom Mix was driving his coffin-nosed 1937 Cord 812 Phaeton convertible, canary yellow, from Tucson to Phoenix on what is now Arizona Route 79, but was at that time US 80. He had stopped at an inn to call his agent, and following that continued to drive until he was less than 20 miles south of Florence, Arizona, where a bridge had been washed out by a flash flood. Having not seen the signs about the bridge, Mix's car made 2 sharp swerves before going through a barrier and off the bridge into the gully below. During the tumult, an aluminum suitcase came from the back of the car and struck him with such a force at the back of the head that it snapped his neck, killing him near instantly. He would be interred at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Some people have speculated that Tom had been drinking on the night that he died. The Oracle Junction Inn in Oracle Junction, where he had called his agent from, was a popular drinking establishment, and in fairness, there probably wasn't a lot of competition in that town. It's still a pretty small place, and I think I know where that inn was located. There's a Mexican restaurant on the site now, if I'm correct, but whatever. Others suggest that he hadn't been drinking, or at least wasn't drunk, and that he was just driving the car too fast and was unable as a result to react to the signs in time. His car has actually been restored to its original condition, and the current owner states that the car, with its Lycoming V8 built in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, but that's another story. Anyway, the current owner of the car states that the car does drive really fast. The gully where Mix's life ended is now known as Tom Mix Wash, and there is a monument nearby. Tom Mix has been portrayed by numerous actors in the time since his death in 1940. Many actors, including Ronald Reagan, who famously donated $100 to the Cameron County birth site, watched him in the movie houses of his youth. John Wayne also grew up watching Tom Mix and closely followed Mix's portrayals of Western lawmen. Many more would come to know Mix through the radio programs which bore his name and continued for some years past his death. Tom himself never actually recorded for the radio, but allowed his name to be used, thus enabling nearly 2 decades of the legendary cowboy. Tom Mix, who died at the age of 60 in 1940, has been seen by many who have never even seen his films, as he appears just to the left of John Lennon on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album cover, and maybe that means something, but I don't know. When I was in college, I had a conversation with a writing professor who said something about the classic Western ending with some Clint Eastwood film. I think he was saying it was High Plains Drifter or Hang 'em High, so late 1960s, early 1970s, regardless. He said something about Eastwood saying something to no one in particular, and that the statement kind of signified his belief, Eastwood's belief that is, that the Western film was dead. I don't know what it was that he said. I was in a debate of sorts with that professor, and to be honest, I thought he was reaching for symbolism where none existed, but let's say he was correct. The Western film as a genre, it's often defined by what the characters represent, the hero being composed of both loyalty, charisma, and grit. Supposing that Professor was correct and that Tom Mix, more than anyone before him, defined the Western hero for decades, give or take a couple of years, depending on whether it was Hang 'em High or High Plains Drifter, whatever. 60 years Tom Mix would define the role, or if you believe me, I still contend that he was wrong and that A Fistful of Dollars was the better movie, and that means that Mix continues to define the Western hero like Byron's characters and Byron himself defined the anti-hero. The one thing Mix did represent, the thing which that earlier cited film reel, the one with all the bogus biographical stuff, the thing that it did get correct was that Tom Mix always taught a down-to-earth code of living based on courage, honesty, and fair play.